very excited to have Caitlin with us today. She's actually visited us twice before. In 2019, she was here in person as part of that year's Dark and Stormy Night series, talking about her science fiction horror novel, The Luminous Dead.
And why caves are terrifying and you should never go in them.
Yes, I was about to say, I think about that every time I see something about cave diving. I'm like, caves are terrifying. And then last year, she was our presenter in October and graciously recorded a reading for us. I hope you saw that. I think that is still up on our YouTube channel if you want to go back in time a year. So 2 days ago, Caitlin's newest novel, The Death of Jane Lawrence, came out, and Publishers Weekly raved about it, saying Starling captivates and horrifies by turn in this intricately plotted, deliciously bonkers secondary world Gothic fantasy. And Hobbs and I both were so excited for this book because we loved the phrase deliciously bonkers.
It almost made it on the cover.
Yeah.
It came real close to getting on the cover.
Aside from being a rising star in science fiction, fantasy, and horror, Caitlin also works in narrative design and has been paid to design body parts. Normally a resident of Oregon, Starling has spent a good deal of time in Chicago since the onset of the COVID pandemic, and is from there that she is joining us today. So please join me in welcoming Caitlin Starling.
Hi, everybody. So the plan today, it's kind of a three-part program. I'm going to read to you from The Death of Jane Lawrence. I'm actually going to read to you from chapter 9. So there's going to be a little bit of lead in I'm going to give you before that. And then we're going to have a small discussion, or I'm going to give a small lecture, I suppose, on the role of houses in horror. And then we'll open it up to questions, discussions, whether about the book, about horror, about the process of publishing and writing, whatever you want to talk about. So let's get started. The thing you need to know before we get into The Death of Jane Lawrence is that this is a semi-traditional Gothic romance, Gothic horror. So if you are familiar with Jane Eyre or Rebecca or similar, that vein, we're looking at a young woman who has ended up marrying a man that she knows very little about, but trusts implicitly, only to find that once she is at his ancestral home, nothing is as it first appeared, and that he may be hiding secrets from her. The point that I'm bringing you into the story, they have gotten married. Jane's husband, Augustine, has told her that she will never stay the night at Lindridge Hall, that house outside of town. But on their wedding night, a series of unfortunate coincidences and problems leads to her staying the night. When she arrives at the house after dark during a storm, her husband, Augustine, is not the man that she is used to knowing. He is paranoid, he is terrified, and he doesn't seem to believe that she's real. We're picking up the next morning, and we're going to follow Jane through her first day at Lindridge Hall. Jane awoke several hours after first light to the sound of voices far off in the hall. They weren't the voices of the Cunninghams or of Mr. Lowell and a patient, but after a disoriented moment, she remembered that where she was, the mudslide, Augustine's nerves. That wasn't how she'd planned to spend her wedding night. She wasn't sure exactly what she'd imagined, but it hadn't been a storm, hadn't been her husband's strange confusion and fear. Was he all right? Could a man truly believe his wife wasn't real? Augustine was too young to have served in the war, but that didn't mean he couldn't have memories clinging to him like a shroud. After all, hadn't she herself balked at just the idea of returning to Camhurst? She had spent years tucking away those terrible memories of the shelling and the gas attacks where she would not think of them, and yet she still had nightmares occasionally. Maybe that was what she had roused him from, and why he was too afraid to stay at his surgery, where anybody could hear his weakness or see him wandering his halls, disoriented and fearful. Or maybe he stayed out of sentiment, despite whatever nightmares plagued him here. People were irrational. So was she, wanting to be close to him, hoping he still felt the same feelings she did, despite their awkward courtship, the rules they had both begun from that they now seemed destined to break one by one. Was it so strange that he might stay here for similarly strong emotions, illogical but impossible to resist? Just at the edge of her hearing, she could make out Augustine's voice. With the sun so high already, he would surely be on his way back to Larrington. She was amazed he hadn't gone already. She pulled herself from his bed and dragged on her housecoat, slipped on a pair of shoes, and made her way out to the bedroom and toward the foyer. Down by the door, Augustine clutched his bag, talking with Mrs. Pearl. It was Mrs. Pearl who caught sight of Jane first, and Augustine followed the line of her gaze, turning and smiling up at her. Daylight illuminated his face, and he looked healthy, well rested. "Good morning, Mrs. Lawrence," he said. "Did you sleep well?" "Yes," she said, descending the stairway, marveling at how Mrs. Lawrence curled her toes. At her approach, Mrs. Pearl quietly excused herself and disappeared down the hallway that led back to the kitchen. "Has the road cleared?" "Not yet," he said. "I'll be taking Mr. Pearl's horse into town. If it's safe enough by midday for carriages to be out, I'll send somebody to retrieve you. Otherwise, you may have to stay another night." "That wouldn't be so bad." He hesitated only briefly, then asked, "Can I send you anything from town?" She had 2 clean gowns in her valise, and bringing more would be troublesome without a carriage. She would manage. But there was one thing. "A parcel may have arrived for me from Camhurst," Jane said, "a mathematical treatise. If Mrs. Cunningham drops it off, I would very much like to see it." "Of course," he said, "and you may have the whole use of my study." She couldn't stop herself from smiling. "Mrs. Lethbridge will have a breakfast set out for you in the dining room in a little bit," he added. "I will miss you today at the surgery." He looked very much as if he wished to reach out and touch her. She stepped closer, the hem of her skirt brushing over his shoes. "Forgive me, Mrs. Lawrence," he murmured. "I treated you horribly last night. It's been a long time since I had guests, since I've had to remember how to have guests." "I'm not a guest. I would never judge you," she assured him. In fact, she was perversely grateful that the storm had wiped out the road and thereby brought her this far into his confidence. "I wanted you to be here so badly," he said, "that when I heard your voice, I feared I had conjured you from nothing. But I am here now, truly." She thought for a moment to tell him about her own fears, memories of the shelling, the gas attacks, all her childhood pains. She stopped short, unsure of how it would help. But what a strange feeling to want to share them. At last he reached for her. He cupped her cheek, his thumb stroking her skin as he gazed into her eyes. "I must apologize for how foolish I was, thinking that you staying the night here would pose any problem at all. In fact, having you here made everything that much easier." She felt a surge of pride at that. "If the roads are clear, I would very much like to stay the night again, with you. Will you consider it?" He hesitated, barely a breath, but she caught it and the slight tension of his jaw. "I would still ask you to return to the surgery," he said, though he kept his tone light. "Mr. Lowell will need the night off." She had agreed to those terms, and she would live up to them until they both agreed she need not. "He will," she said. "I understand. I do have something for you, though." He pulled a thin book from his bag. "My monograph on Mr. Etheridge. I thought you might like to read it." "Of course," she said. She took it from him and opened it to the frontispiece, where Augustine's name was printed in large, bold letters. "How horrid is it, though? The illness, I mean, not the writing." "Well, I wouldn't recommend it for bedtime reading," he said. "Even with all the medical theory laid on top of it, it is a terrifying tale. He was always in good cheer, but sometimes when I think of what he went through, his body turning to bone around him until he could no longer move, it's not the best for the nerves, even on a good day." "I shall take that into consideration," she said, "but you may be surprised to learn that I have nerves forged of steel." "I'm not surprised at all," he said, tucking an errant strand of hair behind her ear. That single touch made her feel half drunk. "I'll see you this evening." "I look forward to it," she said. He looked at her for another long moment, drinking in the sight of her in his foyer like a patient tasting rich broth for the first time in weeks, and then he turned from her, took up his oiled coat, and left the hall. Draped in daylight, Lindridge Hall was still undeniably strange. Hallways did not run in sensible lines, and the house sprawled more than it needed to, given the rooms it contained. She found several fake doors that only confused her more. On the 3rd floor, the pressed tin ceilings were embossed with intricate geometric patterns, eschewing the more common botanical inspirations. More than once, as Jane wandered the halls that morning, clutching the chatelaine she had borrowed from Mrs. Pearl, she would catch a glimpse of a room or the angle of a hallway and think that she saw some grander design to it, some shape that was only visible from a certain perspective. And then the illusion would disperse. The things that made Augustine feel ashamed, the undusted gasoliers, the wainscoting with its chipped paint, the worn, mildewing runners in the hall, all barely registered in the face of such undeniable oddities. She drew back dusty curtains to let the watery sunlight spill inside the house and wondered at the small things she found abandoned. An iron candlestick with a half taper of melted wax here, a sheaf of pianoforte music there, all of them fragments of a life that had once been lived here. Beyond those shards of history, the rooms were empty, suppurating with an omnipresent damp. The west wing of the third floor smelled of must and rot, and it only grew stronger as she opened the last door onto the library. Ceiling-high, empty bookshelves surrounded dusty chairs and tables. A great arching bowl of green glass, condensation running down its metal girding, crowned the room and trapped moisture within. Some of the panes no longer fit well in their frames, and rain entered along the seams, flowing down to where it had begun to rot away at the floorboards. The stench of mildew was relentless. It had been abandoned just like all the rest. This entire grand house abandoned. How did that happen? And yet how beautiful it must have been when the glass was polished and the sun shone in undisturbed, when the room smelled of wood smoke and paper and ink. She could have spent days lost in stories there. But now, here, she left it with a saddened heart. At the stairs, she met Mrs. Pearl, who was carrying something dark in her arms. It was sooty, the surface cracked like a half-burnt log, but the shape was all wrong. Strangest thing, ma'am, Mrs. Pearl said, when she noticed Jane looking. I found it in the old master bedroom, but I am sure I cleaned the whole room last week, and there have been no fires there since I came here. It must be new, though the ashes seemed very old. What is it? A doctor's bag, I think, but I can't imagine why it would have been burned. She shifted it in her grip, and the contents rattled, metal and glass. She looked uneasy holding it, and Jane held out her hands. I can take it, Jane said. I'll get it cleaned up. It's no trouble, ma'am. I have little else to do, Jane said, and Mrs. Pearl passed the bag to her. It was heavy and cold. Mrs. Lethbridge was not in the kitchen when she arrived, so she took the bag straight over to the basin sink. She eased it open, wiggling free the stubborn catch. Its structure held, revealing pockets filled with broken glass, several scalpels, and other tools she was not as familiar with. Mrs. Pearl was right. Why burn such a thing? The tools were of fine make, and aside from the fire damage, she could see no other defect. Jane fished out each shard of glass, piling them off to the side. The bag was likely unsalvageable, but it was an easy place to start. From there, she freed the larger tools, pieces of metal and horn she didn't know the names for, and several clamps, delicate when compared to those used by carpenters, but horrible when she thought of them applied to flesh. She washed them all under the tap with slivers of Castile soap, then set them out to dry much as if they were silverware. She'd learned a thing or two about instrument preparation from Mr. Lowell over the past week, most notably when she had assisted Augustine in what he had called a pupillary incision surgery. She'd watched as he had taken a scalpel to an old woman's eye, clouded over from an old injury and exposed by a metal spreader, and cut a slit that, he said, would become her new pupil, restoring some measure of sight. The woman had thrashed when her eyelids had been opened and had moaned from the ether, but when the surgery was done, she had thanked Augustine over and over again. The paradox of medicine, pain and relief, life and death. She was cleaning the second scalpel when she slipped and cut the tip of her finger. The metal clattered into the sink and she hissed, closing her eyes against the pain. When she opened them again, crimson blood was spattered along the sides of the basin, tainting the water as it spiraled down the drain. Grimacing, she shoved her hand beneath the tap and squeezed at her finger until the blood finally slowed. She eyed the rest of the implements warily. There were only a few left, and she made short but careful work of them, ever mindful of another prick. Back in the foyer, Jane gazed up at the staircases and the gallery walkway, considering resuming her explorations where she'd left off. Aside from Augustine's room and study, she'd seen very little of the second floor, but to her left stretched another hallway, and even with her knowledge of the rest of the house, she couldn't picture where it might lead. She followed it. There were only a few rooms branching from that hall, servants' quarters or storage closets, only one of which was in active use by Mrs. Pearl. Jane almost turned back, but then she saw a glint of metal in the dim light at the far end of the hall. There were no windows, and the gaslights did not extend all the way to where a door stood shut tight. And yet the light caught, glittering, and drew her closer. The door was sealed with a line of 3 old keyholes and 1 newer padlock. That was what had glinted in the dark. It was attached to the door and framed by brackets that looked much weaker than the lock itself and out of place, hastily applied. Frowning, she tried each of the keys on her chatelaine. The keyhole locks gave way, but the padlock remained steadfast. She ran her thumb across the metal. It was bitingly cold, and she pulled away with a wince and a flash of reflexive alien dread. The chatelaine fell from her hand. It swung from where it was attached to her dress, rattling in the silence of the hall. What could be so wrong with a room that would be locked up so tightly that the servants could not access it? And that is where I'm going to stop the reading. So the next bit, and I think you'll see quite quickly why it is the next bit, is our little discussion and our lecture, which is going to be on Houses in Horror. Can someone in the chat let me know that you have seen that this is up on your screen, easily visible, all that fun stuff? Perfect. Awesome. Thank you all. Okay. Give me 1 second while I pull up my notes on another screen real quick. I have to convince it that I really want to see my notes on it, which is always frustrating. And for those of you who don't get the fantastic pun, in my opinion, that I do have to give my husband credit for, if you've ever watched HGTV, there is a show called Homes on Homes, which is about remodeling houses. And if you don't know who H.H. Holmes is, I will be telling you in just a second, you know, once I figure out why Google Sheets does not like me. Oh, it really doesn't like me. There we go. Okay. Sorry about that. New technology woes. So H.H. Holmes on Homes, or Houses in Horror. The quick explanation of that joke, for the people who did not get it, or who may have, it's been a while since you may have read The Devil in the White City, which I have to confess, even though I live in Chicago, I have not read this yet. It is very high on my to be read, but I haven't gone into it quite yet. H.H. Holmes, only one of his many names, was a really big insurance fraud guy, and also coincidentally a serial killer in Chicago in the late 1800s. He began construction on what became known as his murder castle in 1887, and it was mostly completed by 1892. He liked to change around the plans, fire construction crews, partially to keep the total design of the building secret, except known only to himself, but also partially to get out of paying his bills. And by the time it was completed in 1892, it was 3 stories. It was 2-story. The second and third story were rooms and apartments. The first story was businesses, including a pharmacy that he ran, and spaces he rented out to other businesses. During the Chicago World's Fair, he notoriously took in several, mostly women, who were coming to the city and seeking work, allowed them to move, took their rent money, and then brutally murdered them. Sometimes after getting on their wills, so that's always fun, or at least on their insurance payouts. The building had like secret rooms, hidden doors, chutes down to the basement where they had vats of acid, and a couple, like a gas chamber, a room that was a gas chamber that he could like look in on to watch the person die. Fantastic. Probably some of the stories are wildly exaggerated, but the building definitely existed, and he definitely did kill several people and then sold their bones to medical schools. Super fun. And can't you imagine how fun a HGTV show that was run by him would be? Moving away from absolutely terrifying real world things, let's talk for a second about haunted houses. Haunted houses, I think, are probably the thing that comes to mind the fastest when we think about houses in horror. One of the photos there, hopefully a lot of you have seen this, the original Amityville house, Amityville Horror. Top right is from the show or the movie Paranormal Activity, which when it first came out, I refused to watch because A, I was very scared of it, and B, I thought it would be cheesy. I watched it last year for the first time. It actually holds up very well. And down on the bottom right is the house from The Conjuring, the first Conjuring movie. Haunted houses are interesting to me in particular because they usually follow a very traditional storyline, which is a new family. Either they've just gotten married or they have young children, but they are invariably young. They're buying what is usually their first house, and they move into this house thinking that it is their new start and the beginning of their story as a family, only to find that they are running straight up against somebody else's past that is haunting them, that is trying to drive them out or trying to entice them into certain flavors of darkness. This is, in some ways, this is the thing that everyone has a story, right? Everyone knows somebody who their house is haunted. I mean, even for myself, apparently when I was a toddler, I used to tell my mom about the old man on the stairs, who was benign. I apparently liked him. I thought he was a great friend. But my mother was like, "Oh, great, is our house haunted? Fantastic." There's a lot of stories to play around in this space and a lot of distortions. But I think the thing that really does anchor haunted house stories is this new family trying to start a new life, and how you can't just take over something that already exists, even with all the good intention in the world, and move forward without knowing its history. I have for you here a selection of reading recommendations. If you haven't read The Haunting of Hill House by Shirley Jackson, please do. It is one of my favorite books, not just one of my favorite horror books, but one of my favorite books of all time. The attention to detail of the character psychology is fascinating, but I will mention that it is not what I just laid out as the basic haunted house storyline. It is instead very much focused on basically supernatural researchers, people who are going ghost hunting, which I think is it's a very modern feeling story in that sense, because of course we have all these reality TV shows and stuff that are based around this idea of, okay, go in, Shirley Jackson's characters don't have like an EMF meter and temperature gauges, but they are there allegedly, supposedly, to be scientifically describing this situation. As with most ghost stories, it becomes very personal, very fast in distinct ways for each character. There was a great discussion once on a podcast called Last Podcast on the Left about how hauntings can be, they're essentially interior. The haunting, the things that happen in the house, the rattling, the knocks on the walls, in more dramatic stories, things being thrown across the room, those things are all external and scary, but the real effect of hauntings happen when the characters are alone, and it happens in their relationship to the house that they are a part of, and what inside of them is haunting them from their own past. It tends to resonate. Also on this list is The Family Plot by Sherry Priest, which is very fun. Going back to our HGTV intro, it's a bunch of house rehabbers who are coming in to restore a house for sale. And they come across, again, the history of this place that wants to reach out and draw them in. The third book, The Good House, on this list, I have heard amazing things about. I have actually not read it yet. It is, again, high on my to-be read, but would extremely recommend it. And Tanana Rivdu is widely viewed as basically the queen of Black horror. So it's going to go in depth into history and into patterns of trauma, I'm sure. Next up is one that I find to be the most terrifying. I think that probably many of you will agree with me, because it's the closest to reality, and that is home invasions. In its most basic form, we're talking about things like Halloween and all those traditional slasher movies where sometimes it's a babysitter in someone else's house, but it's still, the house is the central location, and it is supposed to be protective. It is supposed to be a safe place. And instead it is invaded in some way, it is violated, and it becomes the backdrop of the struggle. It's, often, what's the best way to put this? It's just, it's deeply viscerally upsetting, right? It's a situation in which your knowledge of your own house is the only thing that might keep you safe. And up on this upper right, that is a screenshot from the movie Hush, which I think I learned today was also made by Mike Flanagan, the guy who made Midnight Mass and The Haunting of Hill House and The Haunting of Bly Manor. So if that's your thing, I definitely recommend it. That movie is about a deaf author who lives alone in the woods and has a very elaborate security system in her house, and a man decides to terrorize her. That's our guy in the mask right there, and the beanie. And the movie takes place entirely in that house and in the very, very near surrounding environment. So like, the backyard. And it is skin crawling upsetting, right? And then down in the right, there is a little screen grab from NBC's Hannibal, the TV show, which flirts around in a lot of different genres of horror, but does have a episode called Buffet Freud that is about a woman who thinks that she is dead and keeps breaking into people's houses, essentially trying to make contact, but the nature of her illness is that when she sees people that she thinks she can trust, her brain goes, no, you can't trust them. That's an imposter. And so she lashes out quite dramatically. In the realm of books, we have The Cabin at the End of the World, probably the best. That and The Need, I think, are the best known on this list. Cabin at the End of the World is about two men. They are on vacation with their daughter, and some religious zealots break into their house and hold them hostage because they think it's the end of the world. Absolutely super stress-inducing. And it reminds me of what I've heard, again, another thing I have not personally consumed, but a movie called Mother, which I believe has Jennifer Lawrence in it. And that movie is about, among other things, I've heard it's wildly allegorical, a large party that suddenly invades the home of the main character, and they act like they know the house better than her, and they won't leave when she asks them to leave. She sets boundaries, they ignore them. It's less of a violent invasion, but it's no less of a violation of those boundaries. We also have Helen Phillips' The Need, which is, again, on my to be read, but that is also a home invasion story. I believe some things come in through the window one night and menace her and her children. Bedfellow by Jeremy C. Shipp is, as you can kind of see from the front cover tagline, something comes into their house, and the way he approaches this is so fascinating because the people in the house keep forgetting the moments of the boundary crossings. It becomes the new normal, but very quickly and very unnaturally. So they have a moment of terror when this guy is breaking into their house, physically breaking into their house, and then they look away, and when they look back, they're like, oh yeah, that guy's always been here, which is the most unsettling concept I think I've ever heard of. It's a novella, so if you want a very quick read this Halloween, it's a great choice. Another novella is The Murders of Molly Southbourne, where a girl grows up having to learn that whenever she bleeds, it creates very quickly a clone of herself that is deeply murderous. And part of the plot does revolve around her family home being essentially laid siege to by these clones of herself, with her parents trying to protect her. Next up, and this is the third category, the third of three categories, is Gothic Mansion, starting to bring it back around to The Death of Jane Lawrence. I am sure many of you grew up on Jane Eyre or Rebecca, or any number of Gothic horror fiction, Gothic romances. As you can see on the top right, there's a whole host of books from the 50s through the 70s that can be summed up as woman running away from house during a storm, possibly in a nightgown, probably looking over her shoulder. It was an entire cover genre. I kind of wish that The Death of Jane Lawrence had a cover variant that was Jane running away from Lindridge Hall, looking over her shoulder at the house on the hill. There is she does run away from the house at one point. That does happen. It is not the same time when she is out in the middle of a storm and looks up and sees one light up in the house windows. So Gothic horror is this very interesting story type that often, it almost exclusively has to do with issues of marriage and relationships, but from a different angle than haunted house stories do. In some ways, you could almost say they're the same thing. They're unknowable what's going on within the walls, and are the difference between a haunted house story and a Gothic story, in a way too, is that in a haunted house story, at least at the beginning, sometimes this breaks down, the young wife can usually turn to her spouse and be like, what is going on? The new wife doesn't have that option. They do not have someone in the family that lives in this house they can trust. Usually it is the new one in this situation, and their new spouse has been there for years, for generations. And the family that she is married into knows all the secrets, but is not telling anybody. So you have a lot of the same things at play, but you have an added level of isolation, of distrust, of violations of privacy, where just the ghosts that are character, but it's also the person or people that she has just tied herself to for her own security. So on the left, that is, I believe, a still from the original movie version of Rebecca, not the recent Netflix adaptation, which I have not seen yet. And down on the right, and this is also the same as from the very first slide, that is Allerdale Hall from the movie Crimson Peak that came out back in 2015 that Guillermo del Toro did. Your reading list for Gothic horror, obviously classics like Daphne du Maurier's Rebecca and the new best-selling hit Mexican Gothic, both very, very classic in style. Mexican Gothic, of course, adds a couple new influences, like it's not in Europe, it's in Mexico. It has to do a lot with the culture, the culture of Mexico, including old silver mining families and new money and all this stuff in the 1950s. And our main character is in fact not marrying into the family, but her cousin has married into the family and has basically gone silent. Her letters have gotten very weird and very intermittent. And so she goes to try and get her cousin out. So she has a layer of remove, and she goes in with an initial distrust that really puts a new spin on the genre. Also on this reading list, Under the Pendulum Sun by Jeanette is a fantastic Gothic story that came out a couple years before the current boom, and has to do with a woman going to visit her brother, who is a missionary in fairyland. And the Gothic house in particular is in fairyland. And so she is both trying to figure out what has happened to her brother. He's there, but something has changed with him. And also learning this entirely new world with this entirely new set of rules. It's this great exploration of faith and the tensions of being a missionary in a place that may not welcome you, as well as family and your very standard, what exactly is going on with this house. And The Secret Skin by Wendy Wagner is coming out at the end of this month. It's again, a novella, very short book, and it's set in the Pacific Northwest. It's actually set in the coastal Oregon region, set in the 1920s. I can't remember where she said she based off entirely, but I believe she grew up in Astoria. So, or close to. She's probably going to message me after this saying, no, I did not grow up in Astoria. I grew up much further south. But it has to do with old timber families and sawmills and all the fun bits of Oregon history that sometimes we may not like to think about so much. And this new look at the genre is the sister of the main family is coming to visit. So she knows some of the secrets that her house is hiding. And she meets the young wife of her brother who does not know the secrets. And they form an alliance essentially to figure out what's going on and to get out safely. And of course, there is my own book, The Death of Jane Lawrence. One of the main recurring themes in this book, of course, is the house itself and what it means and what threats it holds. And at some point, Augustine does say to Jane, I swear to you, I am yours, every inch save what this house demands of me. And Jane has to figure out exactly what that means. So that's Houses in Horror. The selection I read to you today is Jane's first real experience with Linderidge Hall, and it is her first real moment of noticing that perhaps not everything is as Augustine has been saying it is. The locked door in that basement and the burned doctor's bag point to things going on that are far beyond what she imagined when she approached the eligible young bachelor doctor in town and said, hi, I need to get married. I don't want to have a romantic marriage. I'm happy to stay in town and never go to your, and we can live separately because I know you live outside of town all the time. That's fine. Surprise, there is a reason that he lives outside of town, and it's not one that he's excited to share with her. So I think that's it. I think we are ready for Q&A. Thank you for listening to me ramble about houses and horror, and hopefully I have more stuff to share with you.
Thanks so much, Caitlin. That was awesome. Folks, if you have questions, feel free to type them in the chat box, and we will read them out and make sure that you get answers of some kind. I have a question to get things started, though, which is,
Yeah.
I'm wondering, in what way do you feel that your take on Gothic, stories departs from kind of the classic?
Yeah, I think the most obvious way is that when Jane enters into this marriage, she thinks she's entering it under no illusions. This is not she's been swept away by love. This isn't a Rebecca and Mr. De Winter's situation. And she thinks that she can handle whatever happens because she has no real involvement. She has no emotional buy-in with this whole situation. But she finds very quickly that the way her mind works does not allow her to walk away when things get obviously bad. There is a moment in which she's left Lindridge Hall. Her marriage is fine. And she could never go back if she didn't want to. And she finds herself drawn back to the house of her own volition and not because she's trapped there. And then there's a whole bunch of stuff that gets thrown in with ritual magic and secret societies and all sorts of weird mathematical stuff. But I think the main thing is that Jane has her own reasons for going back to that hall and not wanting to leave when the option is presented to her.
Cool. Melanie would like to know if you visited any haunted houses while writing.
No, because I am a scaredy cat. I am terrified of many things. That's also why a lot of the horror movies that I've referenced, I've only seen some of them because I usually enjoy them when I watch them, but I just look at them in dread. So like I haven't seen the new Haunting of Hill House series either. But yeah, haunted houses, they could really get me. The closest I've ever come is there is a stage show in New York called Sleep No More. It takes place in a 5-story warehouse where you are free to explore the entire set at will. It's the first 3 floors are like a hotel, the 4th floor is a town, and the 5th floor is a hospital and graveyard. And the plot that plays out is very similar to Macbeth, and you can follow the characters if you want, but otherwise you can explore. That's about the limit. So there's no one there that's going to jump out at you, but that it has a lot of atmospheric music and sound cues and creepy things to find. Like there's a store in the 4th floor town section that is a taxidermy shop that has an altar in the back that you can like pick things up from, and you can read through the notes of the character that ostensibly keeps that store. That's about where I'm willing to draw the line.
Alex asks, without too many spoilers, what Gothic tropes did you know you had to include in Jane?
Well, I mentioned Jane running away from the house and looking back over her shoulder, and the light up in the window at the very top of the house, but everything else is dark. So those were in very early. Dark and Stormy nights, honestly. There's a lot of rainstorms in this book. There are a lot of momentous moments of lightning and thunder happening conveniently. And I also really wanted to include the moments of tenderness and attraction between Jane and her potentially dangerous new husband. It's easy from the outside to be like, oh God, if you ever try and sell a romance where it's very clear that the guy is up to no good, like it's going to be hard, like it's just going to be frustrating and irritating. And I was like, okay, challenge accepted. I'm going to try and make you believe that these two people despite the secrets that Augustine is carrying, have a connection and in a different world would have been a fantastic fit for each other. But unfortunately, this is the world that they've been given.
What was your writing process like for this? And was it any different from your writing process from, say, The Luminous Dead?
So I actually wrote these really close together. I wrote The Luminous Dead mostly in 2015, and I wrote Jane Lawrence mostly in 2016, and this was before I sold either of them. So this was just me stuck in my head by myself. And in terms of getting words on the page, it was very similar. I grew up doing National Novel Writing Month, where you try to write 50,000 words during the month of November. And, you know, from the age of 15, I was able somehow to do that. And then I circled back again once I was out of college and on my own. And I used it as an excuse to get through these ideas I had in my head. So both of them were written about from November through the end of December, because they're more than 50,000 words, a year apart. But by the end of The Luminous Dead, I had learned that you can actually let characters be alone. That was not intuitive to me before I wrote The Luminous Dead, that you can have entire chapters almost completely devoid of dialogue, for instance. And if you do it right, you can still keep them interesting. It's a risk, but it can be done. So by the time I got to Jane, I was able to envision a plot where Jane was stranded alone for fairly large portions of the book and feel confident enough to tackle that.
Okay, I've got another question from Alex, who asks, you mentioned internal hauntings as opposed to external hauntings, doors closing on their own, etc. Is it hard to strike a balance between the two? Do you like one more than the other?
I actually like external hauntings more, but I am afraid of overusing them because they are the equivalent of, not quite, I was gonna say the equivalent of the horror movie sound effects. The reason why I have trouble watching horror movies is because the sound effects are really powerful to me. External haunting things are big, right? They're splashy, they're doors slamming, they're pipes knocking, they're, you know, things being tossed off desks, they're actual apparitions walking the halls. And internal hauntings are things where reality seems to distort. They're a little bit more subtle. And the thing with external hauntings is they're really sexy, but you can overuse them or you can use them in a way that doesn't land very well. Whereas internal hauntings, at least for me, only ever arise out of the character. And so they're going to slot into the world more seamlessly. So I tend to rely on internal hauntings more than external. And I kind of think it's not so much that I can't do external hauntings or that they can't be done well or anything like that. I'm just nervous about screwing it up. So perhaps in a future book, there will be more external hauntings.
Speaking of future books, do you have a project that you're working on right now?
I have two, neither of which have anything official to talk about. One is contemporary, and that's about all I can say about it. But you may be hearing about it sooner rather than later. The other is one that I've referred to on social media before as Pardon the Language, Funky Bee's book. It is a fantasy horror. So the way we have discussed, my agent and I have discussed it, is American Horror Story, but set in Westeros, for those of you who like Game of Thrones.
That sounds super awesome. Does anyone else have any questions? Here we go. Are you excited about any new horror books, movies, or shows coming out?
I need to finish watching Midnight Mass. I started it last weekend and then it got lost. You know, I stopped watching it because book release happened, but everything I've seen about it so far makes me very excited for it. Let's see. I'm not even sure if this counts as a horror movie, but I really, really enjoyed The Green Knight. And I think it is a horror movie in some ways. So if you haven't seen that, I would highly recommend it. In terms of books, I really want to get around to reading Summer Suns by Lee Mandello. Have not gotten to it yet, so I can't say much about it, but I understand that it's Southern Gothic with racing, like street racing, I think. I'm trying to think if there's anything else. Those are the big ones. I mostly just have a lot of catch up to do. Like I want to see Mandy and The Color Out of Space, and I probably should get a Shudder subscription. That's what I'm hearing from myself. All right.
Hey, I'm not seeing any other questions. Last chance.
Last call.
Type quickly.
Anything you've ever wanted to know about publishing? I would say anything you want to know about Chicago, but I know almost nothing about Chicago because since I moved here during the pandemic, I have barely left my apartment. Anything you want to know about my background? There's a cow pelvis over there.
Is it harder to write a novel or a novella? Is the next question.
Novella. Novellas, you have to keep an eye on side characters and side plot lines. Those usually like to take off and take on a life of their own, but in a novella, you have to kind of keep a very clear set of guidelines in front of you. You cannot go over your word count or else it's no longer a novella. So I actually usually start from the word count. Novellas, for those of you who don't know, are between, I think, 20,000 to 40,000 words long. It's about half the length, half to a third the length of a standard book. And for myself, I know about how long my chapters are. So I go, okay, 40,000 words, I've got 20 chapters. What can I do in 20 chapters? And I break it down from there. But it does take a lot of restraint because you during the course of writing anything that can be 20 chapters long, you're going to be like, oh, what if I did this? What if I did this? But if you go down those routes, you will not have a novella. You will have a short novel. And for some reason, short novels are not a thing.
When you are working on a story, you said you kind of break it down like, okay, I've got 20 chapters. Do you like physically map it out like with note cards, or is it all like on the computer?
Computer. I'm very much, I mean, I grew up using computers, so I mainly work on computers. If something is not working in terms of detail, I will do it on paper because then I can be away from my computer. It kind of makes my brain work a little bit differently. But generally, I start just with a file with a Word document numbered 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 down to however many scenes I think I'm going to need. And I start slotting things into it. I do use a program called Scrivener, which is the digital equivalent of having note cards, so that once you have these ideas for various scenes, you can put each one on its own note card, and then you can see them all at once and shuffle them around to rearrange them, which I find extremely handy. It is much easier than writing from start to finish in Word, because you can pop in and out at the exact moment that you want in the book.
Great. Well, thank you so much. It is about 10 to 5. I don't know if you had anything else that you wanted to share with us, or if we should close things out.
The only other readings I have are from the beginning of the book, so I feel like it's going to be going backwards for a lot of people. I think that might be it.
Okay. Well, oh my gosh, thank you so much. I actually have The Death of Jane Lawrence checked out to me right now. I'm sorry if any of our participants are waiting for it. I will try to read it really quickly because I think it has like 5 bullets on it already. But I'm really excited to read it, and I just really appreciate you being here today. And thank you to our audience as well. I think this worked out great.
Thank you for having me back.